And this is I think a hugely significant night in at least, I'm going to say 6 people's lives. Don't ask me why that is. I just think it's a number that God's given me. because there are at least 6 of you here tonight that are going to take his call seriously to get into the mountain of culture that we call business and to start to reshape it. There is a perceived inconsistency or incongruity maybe in some people's minds between Christianity and business. But I'm going to assume for a minute that most of us here tonight at least understand that God is for business. The best example I can give you of that is a guy called Jesus, who was born into a family business. And his dad was a carpenter. It's improbable that he was a carpenter stuck in a little tiny dark wood shop somewhere making coffee tables and wooden bowls. Because the word for carpenter in Hebrew is the word nagar or nagar. And that's very annoying, I get feedback. Can you still hear me? Yeah. And that word actually means master tradesman or craftsman. And so it's most likely that Jesus was born into a family business of a local and probably highly esteemed tradesman, craftsman who built houses. And he followed, we think, his father's line in that and would have understood all of the joys and tensions of working in a family business. So although he ended up as this rabbi teacher, he started off life in a family business. That's where I started off life. Bill Johnson says he's a 5th generation pastor. I'm a 5th generation businessman. And so I really feel that I didn't know that growing up terribly well, that there was any value in that. I felt growing up as a young man that the order of the hierarchy was missionary, minister, and then when you got outside full-time Christian work, the next people that were really important that were asked to stand up in church on a Sunday were teachers and nurses and doctors, blah, 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 blah. Nothing wrong with those people. But the lowest of the lowest of the low was business people, and then beyond that, lawyers. Sorry. But it ain't the way it is in the Bible, because God is a businessman. He works, his son worked, Jesus, and that was the launching pad into his ministry. And so God's heart beats for business, absolutely, unequivocally. Now the incongruity comes in the sense that so many Christians over the years haven't modelled integrity and honour terribly well, and so therefore people say things like, how could you be a Christian and be in business? But tonight hopefully we'll try and unpack that a little bit and look at some people who model that a lot better than you may realise. There is absolutely no difference between sacred and secular. None at all. That comes from Greek thinking, which splits sacred and secular. The Bible knows nothing about that. God inhabits everything and is part of all. And whenever God created the world and created the garden, the word that he used to describe what Adam and Eve did was the word avad, A-V-A-D, from which we get the noun avodah, and that word means work, serving, and worship as well at the same time. So you worked, you stewarded the earth, you cultivated the earth, you developed the earth, and in doing that, you were worshipping God. So God puts huge honour and value upon our work. And it was about 20 years ago that a group of, or 3 guys in particular, had a dream unknown to each other that Scott mentioned, and the dream showed culture represented as 7 mountains, and the mountain of business is the one that we want to try and address tonight. And so the question basically is there any way that we can clearly see that God is interested in business? And is it more than just a guy earning a lot of money and giving 10% to the church and supporting missionaries around the world? So I want to tell you a story about 3 people, and the visual aids will help. The first is Henry J. Hines. Henry J. Hines was born in Pittsburgh in the 1860s. He was born into a Christian home, didn't have an awful lot of money, and as he was growing up, he was absolutely consumed with passion for God and for Jesus. And his whole life was about purity, and he said, Lord, I want to serve you. And the only way I know I can serve you is if I go and become a minister. So he was heading for the Presbyterian Seminary in Pennsylvania when the Lord said, Henry, purity in life and purity in food. So I don't want you going to be a minister, I want you to demonstrate purity in your life and purity in food. At that time there was a lot of additives being put into food, 100 years ago or more, not the sort of things we have now, but sawdust and bits of just yuck. were being put into food. And so Henry thinks to himself, well, all I know what to do is to sell the stuff we have in our back garden, which actually were pickles and radishes. So he started to put them in clear jars and go around hotels, sort of like Andrew does in food service today, and sell them. And people were so impressed with the quality and what they could see in terms of purity that they bought it. And about 10 years later, 20 years later, he incorporated Heinz. When Henry J. Heinz built his factory in Pittsburgh, it was described by the press at the time as a utopia to work in. He paid more money than anybody else. He built factories that were completely and utterly, they were state of the art. People went on coach tours to see them. It was almost a tourist trip. And he funded what we now know as the Sunday School movement. Outside of business, he was the guy who drove probably the largest piece of legislation in America in terms of food, which is the 1906 Pure Food Act, which put massive emphasis on manufacturers to produce food in an ethical way. And so Henry Heinz lived his life in such a way that he basically said, make as much as you can honourably and give as much as you can wisely. The city of Pittsburgh would identify Heinz as probably the #1 guy that had any influence in that city. The second guy was a guy called Andrew Carnegie, who built the railroads in the States, but was an awful man to work for, horrendous. At the same time as Heinz, there was a guy in Atlanta, and his name was Asa. And Asa grew up in a Christian family, and about 18, he decided he was going to leave the village where he lived and go and live in the city of Atlanta. And his parents said, well, we don't have any money, but we'll pray for you some. So he went, he got a job in a chemist, and during the evening when he was bored, he started messing around with his mate, and they developed a new product which they called Brain Tonic. They started to sell Brain Tonic. It wasn't the catchiest slogan you've ever heard. Did quite well, surprisingly. And after a few years, they thought, no, there's a better thing, but we have a better name for it. And so, Asa incorporated Coca-Cola, the single largest brand in the world today. These guys were radical Christians, not the sort of Christians who say, oh yeah, I'm a Christian, and I give 10. These guys were absolutely radical. So the sort of radical things that Asa Candler did was this. Not only did he fund massive, the very university where Trey Shepard studied in Atlanta is called Emory University, he gave $1 million to that in 1900, which is megabucks then. But outside of that, in 1907, when the entire real estate market crashed in Atlanta, by this time Candler owned a bank, and he went to, it would be like going to all the property developers in Northern Ireland today and saying, guys, I'll buy your property, but I'll buy it at the pre-crash price, the 2007 price. Now there's no bank this side of the moon that would lend people today money, never mind say, we'll lend you money against what it was worth in 2007. But he did that because he knew that the property prices would improve. And so what he was doing there was that he was taking the money that he'd been getting from heaven, steering it in such a way that it released it back into the community. That meant that the people who had been disaffected by a crash got money, they didn't crash. 5 years later, when the economy lifted, Candler was able to sell the properties. He sold them at a slight profit, and he sold them in a very honourable way. In 1914, when war broke out, the cotton price crashed in South America to the point that the whole southern states, without exaggeration, faced extinction because they depended on cotton. And probably in one of the most outrageous acts of faith and generosity, Asa Candler staked his entire fortune, the equivalent today of well over £1 billion, to save the southern farmers. And what he did was this: he built a 40-acre warehouse, acre, not 1,000 square feet, 40 acres. That's the size of a small farm. He said to the cotton farmers of the southern states, I will guarantee you a price today of 6 cents a pound, because it was falling all the time. So if you put your cotton in here for a year, it was pretty much worthless. I will loan you money today at a low interest rate. And in a year's time, if the market doesn't increase and doesn't get any better, I'll buy it off you at that price. But if it does get better, I'll give you the new price. So what he did in that stroke of genius was release money back into the economy again, which allowed those farmers to continue farming, and a year or two later, his investment proved to be a safe one. So he took massive risks, and at the same time of doing all that, he was the guy who was teaching Sunday school every Sunday in his city and buying massive areas of deprived housing, knocking them down and building new houses. And in Atlanta today, Candler is certainly held up as a hero. And finally, back in this country, there was two brothers who made this product. I've never seen it before in my life. Whenever I left university, I worked for another company called Mars, and they detested these guys with passion. But the difference between the Mars family and the Cadbury family is this: the Mars family is the most notoriously secret and probably one of the wealthiest families in the world today. You know very little about them. These guys, you know everything about them. Because George and Richard Cadbury were again radical Christians. They grew up working for their dad, and after a while they realised that they could make a bit of money mixing a thing called cocoa, selling chocolate. They built a factory in Edgbaston in Birmingham. It all went very well. It got so good that they thought we need to move. So they built what we now know as Bourneville, and what they created there was what social historians described as heaven on earth. Long before Bill Johnson wrote his book, they said, actually, here's the kingdom of heaven and earth. Because what Cadbury's did was this: they built a garden village with a garden factory. So Cadbury actually said to his architect, now listen, I'm going to spend money, I'm going to buy 120 acres of ground, and I want to design houses for that 120 acres that are really nice. They're almost mock Tudor design houses. No more than 6 to the acre, which is pretty generous because that gave everybody a big garden. And then he said, if you don't see the hand of God in this, architect, don't get involved. You've got to see this as the hand of God doing all of this. So what he did was he built houses, schools. They outside of business, they were campaigning against things like sending kids up chimneys, because that was still an issue in the 1800s in England. They were campaigning on behalf of animals, so the RSPCA was formed because of Cadbury's involvement. They were campaigning for dustbins to be put in the streets so people could have their dustbins lifted. They were campaigning long before fair trade for fair cocoa. So they were travelling to cocoa plantations in the 1900s and saying, we will only buy from you if you treat your workers the way that we would want to be treated. And they built a business which looked something like this: 300 or 400 houses, a massive factory, 2 Cadburys, multi-billionaires who spent every day in the factory, knew the name of everybody that worked for them, would have gone in on a Sunday afternoon and said, it's too hot to work, let's go out and play cricket or football. Workers went out and enjoyed themselves outside. In their house, he built a 700-seater auditorium and entertained 25,000 kids a year from deprived areas of Birmingham, feeding them and entertaining them. They sponsored umpteen missions. They did more probably for the city of Birmingham than anybody ever has done, although it's largely forgotten about now. And so sadly, 2 years ago they were bought out by Kraft. You may remember that. The irony of that being that James L. Kraft, who founded Kraft Foods, was, guess what? A Christian. The only reason we have farming today the way we have it is because in 1820 or something, Cyrus McCormick, who left this country and went to America, had this dream that there was a better way to harvest crops than this and a spade. And he invented a thing called a mechanical reaper. And McCormick International became a well-known agricultural brand, and it became Case International. But the impact that Cyrus McCormick had wasn't just on agriculture, but what it did was this: it meant that I didn't have to stay at home any longer and farm my half an acre to get food for my family. My half an acre was bought by my neighbour, who now had 10 acres. He was farming more intensively. He was now selling me food, which freed me up to go and do other things in my life, following me. So that impact of McCormick was incredible. Henry Hines, his wife, by the way, was a Presbyterian from County Down in Northern Ireland. So there's a couple of things here. Number one, this little part of the world has had a massive impact in terms of business, way beyond anything that we can ever imagine. But more importantly than that, these Christian guys, Heinz, Cadbury, Coca-Cola, William Colgate, who started making soap and toothpaste, and then after a while realised this is quite good, and he formed Colgate, Palmolive, and ended up, he was the guy who said, I believe in tithing, but you've got it the wrong way around. So he instructed his accountants to give away 90% of everything he had, and he kept 10%. R.G. Letourneau, who invented earth-moving equipment long before you've heard of JCBs, was known as God's capitalist in the States and gave away billions of pounds. Again, the issue is this: it's not just that these men gave away money, but it's a number of things. They created employment, and in creating employment, they did something that was critical. Because God has a heart to see you working. God is a worker. God works. It never ever was in his plan for you to sit around all day and just watch the clouds going past. It's not what he does. So there's dignity when we work, and that sense of avodah, that sense of I'm working and I'm bringing worship to God. And the other thing I wanted to say to you was this, is that in the economy we're in just now, where jobs are scarce, everybody is bashing the banks. Which is an easy thing to do. I can stand here for 5 minutes and give you all sorts of reasons why we could do that. But that's not going to achieve anything, guys. And what I specifically felt that God was saying tonight was that some of you are hearing a call from God that you're ignoring maybe just now to go into banking. Don't bash it, get in it and change it. The whole point of those minds of culture dream is that you get in and you start to change from within. And so God is looking for Christian bankers. What were Lloyds and Barclays when they started in the 17th century, 16th century? They were Christians. They were Christian families, they were Quaker families who wanted to find a way of being able to invest money and loan it in an honourable way. Over the years that's changed. But they weathered lots of economic storms before that because they had a very prudent view to money in the past. And so get into the mountain rather than knocking it is what my message would be to you in terms of banking. So there you are, three brands that you see every day, Coca-Cola, Heinz and Cadbury's, radical Christians, guys who would have given every penny away for Jesus. One of them, in fact, whenever Asa Candler died in 1920, he had nothing left. He'd given it all away.
This phone that I found has been receiving a lot of texts, and I'm just going to read them out. Okay, yeah, we've got a number of texts in. Andrew's had a little bit of a heads up because he was looking at Michael, so he might have just a couple of... okay, this is quite an interesting one.
Just quickly introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Just say who you are, what you do.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Linus, Managing Director of Linus Food Service. Most of you might have seen it. Big kind of, looks like a big shed in Coleraine, lots of lorries. But that's my job. I've been running it now for 3 years, and we serve food to caterers.
Okay, so just a little easy one to start us off with. Is there such thing as an honest car salesman? Question mark.
Yes, there is. There's an honest, any salesman, you know, I mean, obviously, look, 30 of the guys I employ are salespeople, and the art of sales is persuasion, and it's influence, and it's somebody wants something, or maybe somebody doesn't know they want something, but to me, the line where you push into dishonesty is when you sell something to somebody when you blatantly know they can't afford it. And, you know, I think salesmen get a bad rap when they maybe sell you insurance or they sell you financing when you don't need to be sold out there. So, you know, I think in any sales job, that is a tough line. But I actually do know some honest car salesmen.
Great. Okay, this can be for both of you to have a little think about. Is there, is making money for the love of it wrong?
No. But it depends where your mind is. So if listen carefully to what I'm going to say, if you pray, Lord, renew my mind so much so that I can have what I want, then it's okay. In other words, if my mind is so renewed and so completely focused on heaven and so completely and utterly, intimately aware of what the Father wants to release on the earth, then it's okay to love making money. What happens here is vital, and it's what you do with it when you make it. It's not okay to make it, to hoard it. There's 5 things you can do with money. You can tithe it, you can save it, you can give it away, you can consume it, and you can pursue all your obligations in terms of taxes with it. So if the last thing on your list is consumption for yourself, then it's probably not a bad thing. But if I love making, you've got to love doing something. Business is about loving making money on some level. Otherwise, you're probably not going to want to get out of it. It's not that easy.
That's good. Okay.
That's good.
That's quite an interesting one because I know kind of starting up businesses and entrepreneurial business starting is part of your heart, Michael. I have been unemployed for a year now. This is the person. Sorry, okay. So I have been unemployed for a year now, but I have been looking to open a coffee shop. But any advice I have tried to get didn't go far, as no one wants to invest in me, hasn't come back, so he has had no kind of interest. What advice would you give me to start up a business? So this person's heart is for a coffee shop, to start a business in the local area, I presume, and they've just had no kind of sense of mentorship or advice in it. So some key.
I mean, there are some. I I hasten to say good government agencies, because probably I could get in a soapbox about how they aren't particularly good. Agencies like Invest NI, but to be honest, I think the key thing in any new business, you've got to be realistic. You've got to ask yourself some tough questions and get friends and family, maybe not your mum or dad, because they'll just tell you you're great. You know, with some good honest people around you, say, okay, is that a realistic plan? You want to open up a coffee shop, which is great, but you know, there are a lot of coffee shops about, so you've got to ask yourself, what's my twist? What's different about that? Why are people going to walk into my shop? Why do I want to do it? And you've also got to be prepared for a lot of hard work. You know, I think it's 50% of businesses fail in that first year. So, you know, that's 50% to succeed, but there's a lot of hard work in business. We all see the Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, and we think, great, wow, they're loaded, loads of money. They put in some serious hard yards, some serious hard work in that. But get some good people around you and ask advice. Don't just kind of jump in, you know, sink all your life savings into something without having it kind of, you know, talk through with some good people. Yeah. But you've also got to be a risk taker. Listen, Richard Branson did it when he started Virgin, you know, Bill Gates did it when he started Microsoft. He was a young guy, loved playing with computers. That's how these people started.
I don't think there's very many businesses, if you look at any really successful businesses, behind every story, including minus food service, has been an awful lot of pain in the early stages. And stages where you're thinking this just is not going to work. And in the story of the guys that you mentioned tonight, every one of them has this in common, that they went through bankruptcy. They failed the first time. And so business requires a huge amount of resilience and belief. And what I would say is, in general, if you in the nutshell, if you have a desire for business, it's hard work. But if it's the only thing you can do, pursue it with all your might. And secondly, you do need to look to the market, and what we need, I'm not knocking coffee shops, what we need desperately are people with new, inventive, witty ideas that some people might laugh at and say, that's a silly idea, that would never work. Like, you know, a computer, who would ever think that would work? Or things that 50 years ago people would have laughed at, that's what I'm trying to say. But we need those witty, inventive ideas so that we can start multiplying wealth and creating large markets for things, new products which employ new people and which people are happy to buy, etc. Sort of thing Apple do very well. You don't really need an iPad, but how many people have one in this room? Yeah, you see? So clever.
You do need an iPad.
Sorry, you do need an iPad.
Okay, this is quite interesting. At what point does seeking a competitive advantage become unchristian? And how far can or should we go?
I'd probably have a different view from that now than what I would have had 10 years ago. I mean, to be really honest, 10 or 15 years ago when I was in business, without being illegal, I would have pushed it to the absolute limit, because I think you have to play hard. But seeking competitive advantage, you must always act with honour and integrity, is what I was saying to you tonight. You must always do that. Never do anything for a short-term gain. Never do anything that, it's that old cliche, if Jesus was in the room, what would he think of what you're doing? If you've any doubt in your mind, you've just got to walk away from it. But business is war, and business is tough. And when you're in business, everybody outside of your business wants you wiped off the planet. They don't want you to exist unless you're a useless competitor, because they're quite happy to have you there. But by and large, business is war, and it's tough, and so it requires a certain resilience and toughness of mind, but stick within the law and then act with honour and integrity.
Yeah. You asked the question again, sorry.
Okay, at what point does seeking a competitive advantage become unchristian, and how far can or should we go?
Yeah, I mean, Michael's kind of right. I think for every business leader, we all have a moral compass, and obviously we look to the Bible. It's a pretty good guide as to those kind of things, and we look to the law. But I think that's difficult. Business is about competitive advantage. You've usually got to have an advantage over your business, over somebody else's. Listen, there's 5 other guys. If Neil Young was here, he'd probably be telling you who they all were, who are in a similar business to myself. So every single day, I'm out there, and my staff are out there trying to seek a competitive advantage when that new coffee shop opens that they buy off Linuses and they don't buy off X, Y, and Z. You know, that's what we do. But I think we can play fair. Yeah, that's it.
Yes,
We can play fair in that situation. And I think it's hard and fair.
Just let me tell you, this is what they wrote about Henry Hines. No fairer, franker man in business ever lived. Aside from his epigram that every successful business must be run by heart power, he had another memorable saying, make all that you can honestly, save all that you can prudently, and give all you can wisely.
That's good. Great. Okay, this is an interesting one with your comment about lawyers, Michael. I am a lawyer. I am paid to be cynical and plan for failure. This is one of the hardest aspects of the job. Do you have any message for me?
I had a wee look at that question. I suppose in one sense I reject the premise of the question, classic politician, but I just don't, some of them are, but I think there are many different spheres of, being a solicitor, being a barrister, be that defending a criminal, right through to helping companies merge, litigation, defending people. There's lots of different spheres. So I don't think in every single one that every single law company that I've certainly dealt with or lawyer is paid to be cynical. And what was the other phrase? But I just don't I don't agree with it. And I know plenty of lawyers who aren't that way.
And plan for failure.
And I think if that's honestly how that person felt, they should change careers. Genuinely.
It's an aspect of their job, so they
Yeah.
probably enjoy other parts of their job.
Yeah, well, and I think that's typically like every part of our job will all of things that we dislike about our job, but I think if that's the overriding premise, then maybe you want to do something else.
Okay. Some people are asking similar questions, so if I don't kind of read your question out, it's probably because it's really kind of been asked. Okay. This one is directed at you, Andrew. It says, Andrew.
Thanks, Russell.
I'm just going to read the one out of the 7 you sent, Russell. So, it's okay.
Friends like that, eh?
Andrew, how do you believe you and your business is changing the city? And how do you bring a God culture to your business? Boom. Norman is listening.
I'm sure many of you will have seen The Estate on TV, and my mate Jimmy, who's on it, one of my guys on night shift. But he's a classic example. He's a really super guy, genuine, and obviously difficult family circumstances. But it's people like that. I have the privilege of employing 250 people. That is a lot of responsibility, but the way we often think when we're making a tough decision is we imagine each of those people have probably 4 people who depend on them. So that's 1,000 people in the Korean area that I have the responsibility but also the privilege of affecting their lives. And so I take that very, very seriously, that I can actually affect their lives. And I suppose I see it as 1,000 people in this area who are employed, who are being looked after, who have probably a greater quality of life than they would have previously. To me, that's what I'm created to do. I know as a businessman, that's what gives me the thrill. I love, the sell, I love the profit, but that's the thing that gets me up in the morning.
I can say this easier than he can. I've known Andrew a long time and his dad a long time, and actually we competed against each other for a while, which was a funny story in itself. I had a job where I was travelling around the world. Norman started to pray for me that I would come back home and be able to work at home and be with my wife and kids, and all that came true. The difficulty came when I had to go around and say, good news is I got the job, bad news is for my competitors. And so, and here's what I would say. Linuses have built a business in the food service sector which absolutely is based upon service. So they do honour their customers very well. We find it hard in the company I work for, which is a large company in Belfast, I'm not mentioning it, but we find it hard in Henderson's to break through that, because they did common things uncommonly well in terms of service. So the customers were completely convinced that they had a really good service. And I think that in terms of a business, it has a heritage of being faithful to the Lord in so many different areas. In the past, that's looked like Norman being very involved in all sorts of evangelistic outreach and bringing bloody grain and all sorts of things here. But as a company, I can say it without embarrassing Andrew, that they are a model of following God's direction and bringing hope in all sorts of different areas. So pray for them. Pray for the favour of God upon them.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that question in a minute, just a little bit of a lighter one. What colour of tie best helps you succeed in meetings? Question mark.
I honestly don't
Tim
think about
Higgins.
it. But I've got to say, I like a wee red tie with a nice blue shirt, always looks sharp.
Okay, this is quite an interesting question.
You'll be selling those ties at the end.
Yeah. If God inspired so many businesses that have become global brands, a little bit like what Michael was talking about, what do you think is the major reason why this isn't happening today?
Okay, so the challenge in that is this, that Asa Candler, Henry Hines, George Cadbury, Richard Cadbury, other guys like John Lang, who we didn't mention tonight. Lang Construction was the single biggest construction company in the United Kingdom, formed by Christians from where Andy Fearon, his home church, Hebron Church in Carlisle. So these guys in different sectors were all born around the same time. Now, in the past 100 years, in terms of inventiveness and manufacturing production companies, we haven't seen anybody filling that gap to the same extent. So the challenge is this: I think God is bringing these guys to our attention right now, at this time, and that's the relevance of tonight, to challenge some of you to realise those guys started with a dream in their heart and a belief that God had called them to be faithful in everything, in every aspect of their lives. And so my challenge to you guys is that we would start to see, actually there was a headline in the BBC News website last month that says, "Why the world needs another George Cadbury right now." And it could be, and she could be in this room tonight. And I believe that with all my heart. And you may start small, and it may be tough, and it may be difficult, as it is in so many areas of life. But don't let it be another 100 years before we see some other huge brands beginning to grow. Now those guys saw, it wasn't as if they disappeared before the brands became big. They battled through, they saw God's favour and blessing upon it as they were honourable to Him. And so I think God is stirring at the minute, I really do, in so many lives, and challenging people to think, this is possible. It's not impossible. So take it as a challenge rather than a negative.
Super. Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. What is the most difficult thing that you have faced as a businessman so far?
We had a large deal last year that, had we got it or not got it, would make a massive difference to our staff. We would probably have to lose about 25, 30 staff had we not secured that deal, and that was probably the toughest thing to go through. That I think the toughest bit of my job is having the responsibility of knowing that I have to make decisions for 1,000 people and I have to make it right. And it's not, but the toughest part of being any managing director, and other guys in this room will know that, is it's a lonely chair to sit. You sit there on your own, and that's the hardest bit. And I think that's the part where you probably are brought, back to the Father, more and more. And that's when you are on your knees and you're saying, God, I genuinely don't know. We went to that meeting and I said, Dad and I drove up and we said, we don't know which way this is going to come. And we walked out, and thankfully it went well. But I remember we just said it was like the clouds were just kind of cleared. But those are the toughest ones when it comes down to people, having to let people go. Those issues, it's usually businesses. Ultimately, it's like church. It's like anything. It's about people.
I could probably write a book on that one. But the toughest one for me was being chief executive of a business that I thought was profitable on a Friday night, and by Monday afternoon realised had a hole of about £1.25 million. And by the end of that week, we were sold. And so to be in that position through no fault of your own, but through dishonesty and manipulating figures, and then to look at, in my case, it was probably 150 jobs and my own life, and think, I mean, legally I was the managing director, the chief executive, so ignorance is no defence. So even though I didn't know what was going on, because the guy had masqueraded it in accounts for 2 quarters, and so there was no complete audit, so it wasn't picked up, I was responsible. So I went into that business every day and literally spent my face on the floor crying out to God for Him, because He gave me a vision at that time, not one that showed me bringing it to a place of safety, which is what happened, and then I left. But man alive, it is absolutely tough beyond words sometimes. You know what? God's good and gracious, and so long as we keep looking to Him, He brings us through. And That's all part of the deal.
Okay, just going to go for the last question. Do you think God is happy for us to gamble, take risks in business to the extent where bankruptcy is a possibility?
Well, business is a calculated risk, and any startup business, it's slightly different if you're in an established business, but if you're starting, or if you're midway through a business that has generated enough income for it to get to a certain stage and you're now pushing through to the next stage, you potentially are gambling and risking everything. And so I don't think you can be in business at a level and not live with that potential tension all the time. You've got to go for it. It is a risk. So I don't think, the simple answer is no, don't do it if you know you're going to go bankrupt. But if you're convinced that you have to grow your business, go for it. Bankruptcy could be an issue, but I don't think you can avoid that.
I do agree with Michael, but this is one that I've had drummed into me since I was a young boy. My great-grandfather thought it'd be a great idea to make coffins, but it didn't really turn out very well for him, and he lost. Yeah, deadly, very good, Michael. And he lost some money, and then my grandfather, Bobby, had to cycle out to places outside Garva every Friday night to pay off the debt, and that's the story he took with him, and then that's the story he passed to my father, and that's the story my father's passed to me. Now, there is always that risk, and Michael's right, but it's one of the kind of founding principles of our business. We will never go into debt. We never have done, we never will, and I think as Christians there is a principle around that, and I think, look at Proverbs, the lenders, there's so many verses around that, and I think there is always that risk, but sometimes you have to ask the question, is it really worth it? And that's just a line in the sand for me that I'll never cross.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. The point I was sort of making was that, oh, thank you, Lord. That's my point. The point I was making was that when we start in business, even without debt, that don't be fooled into thinking it's going to be plain sailing. There's always the risk that it won't work, that it'll fail, but neither should that hold you back. And some of you at the minute saying, oh, I could never do that. That's good, don't do it. Don't ever think about it. You're not an entrepreneur, you're not made for business. But if there's 3 or 4 of you here thinking, well, yeah, I know, it does sound a bit scary, but actually I'm made for that. That's just what... I listened to Tim Waterstone, who founded Waterstone's bookshop, and he founded it in the back of a redundancy out of a W.H. Smith's, and they said to him as he was going out the door, he got £5,000, don't you ever think of going into bookshops on your own? And he said, I know what I'm going to do. And he faced the most uphill battle at that time, and yet Waterstone's ace has been really successful. So
cool, thank you. Just the last little one, Andrew, that came in. It is rumoured that you have to taste all the food that comes in each day. How do you stay so slim and fit, and what is your regime? Slip that in. That's all I know. Russell?
I'm very grateful I've got other staff who do that.
Right, okay.